Anyway, so like I was saying the other day, after the third of the Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage and Rome, there's only one power left in the Mediterranean, and that's Rome. We're going to see thousands and thousands of slaves being shipped off to the city of Rome, a problem that is going to have a lot of facets to it. We're going to talk about those in a minute. But what I want to talk about right now, and the meat of this video is going to be coming from chapter 11, lesson 3 in your textbook. What I want to talk about right now are some things that set up the introduction of Julius Caesar. There are some components that we need to understand as we get into this, so we can think of this sort of as a pre-video. The first thing that I need to mention is that after the defeat of the Carthaginians, Rome is the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. There just isn't anyone left that can rival them. It's interesting, however, that what's going to apparently happen is that Rome decides to become its own biggest enemy. Rome has had two major problems since it became a republic in 509 BC, and they were the inequity between the two classes of citizens, the upper class patricians and the lower class plebeians, and the existence of the office of dictator. Now, as we recall, the office of dictator is a very peculiar element of Roman politics. We go back and look at the legend of Cincinnatus, who in 16 days was called by the Roman Senate to take control of all of Rome, everything. In 16 days, he raised an army, defeated Rome's enemies, had a triumph or a victory parade through the streets of Rome, and was back plowing at his farm. It was a virtue at that time to give up power, and that's the only way that a dictator does lose power. He must willingly give it up. This is a virtue that will fall by the wayside, and it's going to become a very, very serious problem for Rome. But let's talk about the inequity between the patricians and the plebeians first. We remember from what we were looking at in chapter 11, lesson 2, that you have the patricians and you have the plebeians. The patricians were essentially the nobles who were left after the last of the Tarquin kings, Tarquin the Proud, was removed from the throne. They were never rooted out, and so all of the privileges and lands that they had as nobles, they simply retained those. The lower class citizens were the plebeians, and I guess from 509 to 494, the patricians thought they had pulled it off. They thought that they were going to be the greater among so-called equals in the Roman Republic. But in 494 BC, we see the strike of the plebs. Essentially what happened was the plebeians were getting tired of being treated as second-class citizens. So they were going to take their ball and they were going to start their own home. And the first thing they were going to do was create an army and attack Rome. The patricians wisely wanted to find a very quick political solution to the problem, which of course they did. They created the so-called Council of the Plebs and a mouthpiece or a voice in the Senate who they named tribute. The people's tribute would eventually get the power of veto. There were more concessions made along to take some of the pressure off of this volatile relationship between the patricians and the plebeians. Things like allowing patricians and plebeians to marry, and eventually allowing the Council of the Plebs to pass laws for all of Rome. But keep your eye on this inequity, because even your textbook will confirm in chapter 11, lesson 3, that the real power stayed in the hands of a few wealthy families. Patrician families. There are a few other things that I want to mention before we get into Julius Caesar. Let's talk about latifundia. While the Roman soldiers were off fighting, Roman soldiers who were citizens, who owned land, most of whom were farmers, their farms went fallow. They were not being used. They were not producing. They were not yielding. Some of them were even damaged by the Carthaginian general Hannibal as he attacked Rome from the north. When they came home after the Third Punic War, which was unlike the first and certainly unlike the second, they had been gone for longer than the normal 6-7 month tour of duty. There was no war season anymore. You fought until the enemies of Rome had been defeated, and the Republic's enemies were increasingly further and further away, Spain and over into Greece and beyond. By the time they got home from fighting these wars and securing the Republic, what they found was the dynamic had changed economically. There were, owned by senators, owned by patricians, wealthy families, these large estate farms called latifundia. They were manned not by paid laborers, but by Carthaginian slaves who had been shipped in after the fall of Carthage by the thousands. As a result of this, these latifundia, these huge farming estates, they could make sales lower than smaller farms could because they could sell by volume. As a result, these returning soldiers realized that their small farms simply couldn't make them a living anymore. Hundreds and hundreds of them sold their land to the owners of the local latifundia and went with their families and what little money they got to the one place where they thought they could find work, the cities. Rome's a prime example. The problem is, of course, that these Carthaginian slaves didn't just come into the countryside. They also came into the cities. It was very, very difficult to find paying, low-skill work. And cities became teeming places for disease, crime, unemployment, and very unhappy former soldiers. This is not a good picture. This is a recipe for disaster. And so the politicians in Rome, in a desperate bid to hold on to the power that they had, came up with a plan. It's a pretty famous plan, and it's, I'm not going to say diabolical, but I think you have to have a certain moral flexibility to think something like this is going to work. The idea is bread and circuses. What you do is, instead of actually solving the problems, instead of fixing what's going on, you give everybody cheap or free food and free entertainment. That way their mind is not on the fact that politically, not only have they probably been treated wrong by their generals and the Senate, but they don't have very much power, so nothing is really going to change. Their plight will never get any better in the current system. But the Senate was hoping that an influx of free or cheap food and entertainment would keep their mind off of things. And when I say entertainment, if you're wondering if I mean the Colosseum, I did. The Colosseum and its blood sports were one of the things that kept the masses in cities like Rome and other larger Roman cities from revolting. There were, however, politicians who saw what was going on. Two of the most famous mentioned in your textbook in chapter 11, lesson 3 are Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Both were patricians. Both, Tiberius to a greater extent, but both had military careers. They became a force for change, and as tribunes, they formulated a plan. They wanted to try to fix the situation in Rome. Their plan, however, was not accepted by the Senate, and it was actually a threat to the Senate and its power. See, what they wanted to do, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, were to go to these large estate farms, these latifundia, and literally break them up and give land to these landless farmers. Now, I'm not a huge fan of redistribution plans, but Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus saw the inequity, saw the unemployment, saw the slave labor, saw the economic poison that was in the veins of Rome itself, and realized that without Romans working, producing wages, that there may be no way out of the political or economic tailspin. So this was the plan that they decided on. They wanted, again, to break up the latifundia and give the land to these landless farmers. Tiberius Gracchus was killed by members of the Senate as he proposed this idea. Gaius Gracchus was killed 12 years later. I can't emphasize what a danger sign it is when the very people who are supposed to be passing laws and safeguarding Roman citizens are taking the lives of those who are trying to pass reforms to protect the most disenfranchised. The last piece of the puzzle that we need to understand is this very questionable relationship that is going to be introduced between the army and politics. There was a lowborn plebeian named Marius, who became a general and later a consul of Rome. Sort of a Cinderella story. As he looked around the Rome that he inherited, or the early 100s BC, he realized that the problem, just like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus before him saw, the problem was that you didn't have enough people who were making an income to be buying and selling goods. The economy was stagnating. The middle class was shrinking, if not completely disappearing in some places. And so Marius decided that he would lean on the only thing he knew, or what he knew the most about, and that was the military. Here we have the law of unintended consequences kicking in. You see, as Marius looked around and saw these unemployed people, he came up with a very, very simple solution. We're going to create a professional army. Now, up to this time, the army of Rome was all volunteer. Everybody who served in the army was a landowner who was volunteering. Marius decided that he would actually pay people to serve in a full-time military. They would use that money, buy goods, pump some life and some vitality back into the Roman economy. But the law of unintended consequences kicked in. You see, what you got to understand is that people are going to be loyal to whoever's paying the check. Marius didn't understand that what he was creating was not a economic solution. What he actually created was a system where people became soldiers, became loyal, not to the people in the Senate of Rome, as PQR. Soldiers instead were loyal to the generals who paid them. Petty squabbles between generals and jockeying for political favors became violent and deadly very, very fast. This situation caused one of Marius's former commanders, a man named Sulla, to do the unthinkable. In 82 BC, Sulla actually was the very first person to ever march an army into Rome. He rallied his own troops and marched his army into Rome. He forced the Senate to declare him dictator. And as a result, with Marius's forces defeated, because he was a patrician, he set about saving the Republic. His version of saving the Republic, which included doing things like reducing the power not only of the Council of the Plebs, but the responsibilities of tribunes, while increasing the power of senators. And once he had set things right, or at least right in his own eyes, he stepped down, content that he had saved the Republic. The only thing he'd really done is not only kick off the beginning of about 50 years of what I can only describe as civil war in Rome, but even worse and darker, he introduced the reality that if you want power, all you have to do is march your army into Rome and take it. This is a lesson that will be learned by someone we're going to be introduced to very soon. His name is Julius Caesar. What he does when he crosses the Rubicon will condemn the Republic and begin a brand new idea in Rome.